I used to wake up every morning with my heart already racing. Before my feet even hit the floor, my mind would be spinning with worst-case scenarios about my children, my health, my finances, you name it. For nearly 40 years, worry was my constant companion. It followed me everywhere, stealing precious moments with my family, preventing me from pursuing dreams, and eventually manifesting as physical symptoms that no doctor could cure. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I finally found freedom from the prison of anxiety that held me captive for most of my life. This isn't some miracle cure story. It's about the real, sometimes painful journey of how an ordinary grandmother learned to quiet the storm in her mind. If you've ever felt like worry has stolen too much of your life, this story might just give you hope that it's never too late to change. I often joke that if worrying was an Olympic sport, I'd have won gold medals. But there was nothing funny about how anxiety controlled my life. I come from a generation where we didn't talk about mental health, we just dealt with things and carried on. My mother was a worrier, her mother before her too. I thought it was just part of my DNA, something I had to live with. My earliest memory of anxiety was at age 8, lying awake all night convinced my parents wouldn't come home from their dinner party. By my teens, I was rehearsing conversations for hours before making a simple phone call. When I had my first child in my 20s, worry took on a whole new dimension. Is she breathing? Is that rash normal? What if I'm not a good mother? My husband Tom, bless his patient heart, used to say, Maggie, 99% of what you worry about never happens. He was right, of course. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop the constant barrage of what-ifs that plagued me day and night. As I entered my 50s and 60s, my worry expanded to include everything from terrorist attacks to whether I'd left the iron on. I worried about my adult children's marriages, my grandchildren's futures, climate change, the economy. You name it, I worried about it. The worst part, I was exhausting myself mentally and physically, yet somehow believed my worry was protecting me and my loved ones. As if my constant vigilance was keeping disasters at bay. What a heavy responsibility I'd placed on my own shoulders. 5 years ago, at age 67, something happened that finally forced me to confront my anxiety head-on. I was babysitting my 7-year-old granddaughter Lily for the weekend. We were having a wonderful time baking cookies when suddenly my heart started racing. My palms got sweaty. I couldn't catch my breaths. I was convinced I was having a heart attack. Poor Lily had to call her parents, who rushed me to the emergency room. After countless tests and several $1,000s later, the doctor gave me his diagnosis. Mrs. Wilson, there's nothing physically wrong with you. What you experienced was a panic attack. I felt embarrassed, relieved, and then angry. Angry that anxiety had such power over me that it could mimic a life-threatening condition. Angry that I'd scared my granddaughter. Angry that I'd spent decades letting worry rob me of joy. But something else happened in that hospital room. As I watched Lily coloring quietly in the corner, waiting for her parents to finish the discharge paperwork, I had a moment of absolute clarity. I saw myself through her eyes, not as the fun grandma I wanted to be, but as someone fragile, someone consumed by fear. What? In that moment, I made a decision. I didn't want worry to define the remaining years of my life. I didn't want my legacy to my grandchildren to be fear and anxiety. If I was going to change it, had to be now. My journey began with trying to understand why I worried so much in the first place. With the help of a therapist, yes, I finally sought professional help at age 67, I started to explore the roots of my anxiety. I learned that my worrying wasn't just a bad habit, it had served a purpose in my life. Growing up with an unpredictable father whose moods could shift without warning, I developed worry as a survival mechanism. If I could anticipate problems, maybe I could prevent them. If I could imagine every possible disaster, nothing would catch me off guard. My therapist introduced me to a concept that completely changed my perspective: Anxiety was my mind's misguided attempt to keep me safe. It wasn't my enemy, it was an overprotective friend who didn't know when to stop. I also discovered that my generation had particular reasons for being prone to anxiety. We grew up in the shadow of World War II, with parents who had lived through genuine hardship. We witnessed the Cold War, economic uncertainties, and social upheaval. Being vigilant and preparing for the worst made perfect sense in that context. But here's what really struck me. Understanding the origins of my worry didn't automatically make it disappear. Knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed practical tools to manage the anxiety that had become so deeply ingrained in my daily life. The first approach that made a real difference for me was something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. My therapist explained that CBT is based on the idea that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected, and by changing our thinking patterns, we can change how we feel. She taught me to identify my anxious thoughts and challenge them with evidence. For example, when my daughter was 5 minutes late calling me, my mind would immediately jump to she's had a car accident. My therapist helped me recognize this as catastrophizing, assuming the worst possible outcome with little evidence. Instead, I learned to ask myself questions like, what's the evidence that something terrible has happened? What's a more likely explanation? Has this worry come true in the past? I started keeping a worry journal, writing down my anxious thoughts and then the actual outcomes. Over time, I built up an impressive collection of evidence that my worries rarely, if ever, came true. This didn't eliminate my anxiety completely, but it helped me see how my mind was constantly overestimating threats and underestimating my ability to cope. One technique that particularly helped was the worry time exercise. Instead of letting worries interrupt me throughout the day, I scheduled a specific 20-minute period, my worry time, when I was allowed to worry as much as I wanted. If worries popped up outside that time, I would write them down to address during my designated worry time. This simple practice helped me realize that many of my worries either resolved themselves before my worry time arrived, or seemed much less significant when I finally sat down to consider them. It was like learning to contain a flood that had previously spilled into every area of my life. The second approach that transformed my relationship with worry was mindfulness. Now, I'm not going to pretend I became some Zen master overnight. When my therapist first suggested mindfulness meditation, I laughed out loud. At my age, with my restless mind. Impossible, but she explained mindfulness in a way that made sense to me. She said, Margaret, anxiety lives in the future, in all those what-ifs you're constantly imagining. Mindfulness is simply practicing being in the present moment, where things are usually okay. I started small with just 3 minutes of focused breathing each morning. I'd sit in my favorite chair, close my eyes, and simply notice my breath going in and out. When my mind inevitably wandered to worries about the day ahead, I'd gently bring my attention back to my breathing without judging myself. Those 3 minutes gradually extended to 5, then 10, then 15. I discovered guided meditations specifically designed for anxiety on various apps and YouTube channels. Some days were easier than others, but I began to notice something remarkable. There were moments, brief at first, then longer, when my mind was quiet. When I wasn't worrying about anything at all. I also incorporated mindfulness into everyday activities. When washing dishes, I would focus completely on the sensation of the warm water, the smell of the soap, the feeling of each plate in my hands. When walking in the park, I'd notice the specific shades of green in the trees, the patterns of light on the path, the different sounds around me. These practices taught me that there's a whole world of sensory experience happening right now that anxiety causes us to miss completely. And here's the beautiful irony. The more I practiced being present, the less power my worries had over me. They didn't disappear, but they became like clouds passing through the sky rather than the sky itself. Perhaps the most surprising, and in many ways the most difficult, part of my journey was learning self-compassion. For decades, I'd been my own harshest critic. Not only did I worry constantly, but I also berated myself for worrying. What's wrong with you, Margaret? Why can't you just relax like normal people? This self-criticism created a vicious cycle. I'd worry, then feel ashamed about worrying, which would increase my anxiety, leading to more worry and more shame. Round and round it went. My therapist introduced me to the work of Dr. Kristen Neff on self-compassion. She asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. Margaret, if your granddaughter was struggling with anxiety, would you tell her she's weak and should just get over it? Of course not. I'd comfort her. I'd tell her it's okay to feel anxious sometimes. I'd hold her hand and help her through it. Then why, my therapist asked gently, don't you deserve the same kindness from yourself? Learning to speak to myself with compassion felt awkward at first, almost like speaking a foreign language. But I practiced replacing critical thoughts like, I'm such a worrier with more compassionate ones like, I'm experiencing worry right now and that's okay. Many people feel this way. I learned to place my hand on my heart during moments of intense anxiety, acknowledging my suffering with phrases like, this is really hard right now, or I'm doing the best I can. This simple gesture of self-kindness often brought tears to my eyes, tears that needed to flow after decades of fighting my own emotions. Self-compassion taught me that anxiety wasn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It was simply part of my human experience. And by accepting it with kindness rather than fighting it with criticism, I paradoxically gave it less power over me. While working on my thought patterns and emotional responses, I also made practical changes to my daily life that significantly reduced my baseline anxiety level. First was examining my relationship with caffeine. I'd been a 4-cup-a-day coffee drinker since my 30s. My doctor explained that caffeine stimulates the same physiological responses as anxiety, increased heart rate, heightened alertness, even jitteriness. Reluctantly, I cut back to 1 cup in the morning and switched to herbal tea for the rest of the day. The difference was noticeable within days. Exercise became another powerful tool in my anxiety management toolkit. At 67, I wasn't about to start training for a marathon, but I did begin taking 30-minute walks every morning. The rhythmic movement and fresh air had an almost immediate calming effect on my nervous system. Later, I added a gentle yoga class specifically designed for seniors, which helped me connect with my body in a positive way rather than just monitoring it for signs of disaster. Sleep hygiene was another area that needed attention. For years, I'd fallen asleep to the television, anything to drown out my worrying thoughts. My therapist suggested creating a calming bedtime routine instead. No screens an hour before bed, a warm bath with lavender oil, reading something light and positive, and a short meditation. Improving my sleep quality had a dramatic effect on my daytime anxiety levels. I also took a hard look at how I was consuming news. Like many anxious people, I was a news junkie, constantly checking for updates on disasters, political crises, and economic problems. I realized this was like pouring gasoline on my anxiety fire. I didn't disconnect completely, staying informed is important, but I limited news consumption to once a day and avoided it entirely before bedtime. These lifestyle changes weren't dramatic on their own, but together they created an environment where my mind and body could begin to recognize that the world wasn't as threatening as my anxiety had led me to believe. One of the most healing aspects of my journey came unexpectedly when I joined a support group for older adults dealing with anxiety. After decades of hiding my struggles, sitting in a room with others who understood was incredibly freeing. In that group, I met Elaine, a 75-year-old former school principal who had developed severe anxiety after retirement. We became fast friends, checking in with each other regularly and providing support during difficult moments. There's something powerful about not facing anxiety alone, about having someone who understands exactly what you're going through. As I began to manage my own anxiety more effectively, something wonderful happened. I found myself able to help others. When my neighbor confided that she was having panic attacks, I was able to share resources and techniques that had helped me. When my adult son went through a stressful divorce, I could offer not just sympathy but practical anxiety management strategies. This shift from seeing myself as a victim of anxiety to someone with wisdom to share was profoundly healing. My decades of struggle suddenly had meaning. They had given me insights that could benefit others. I even started volunteering at a local senior center, facilitating a weekly discussion group on emotional well-being. Helping others navigate their anxiety and worry not only reinforced my own progress, but gave me a sense of purpose that further reduced my anxiety. There's a beautiful reciprocity in healing. As we heal ourselves, we become better equipped to help others, and in helping others, we further our own healing. If I had to identify the single most important shift in my recovery from chronic worry, it would be learning to embrace uncertainty. For most of my life, I'd been trying to create certainty through worry, as if thinking about all possible negative outcomes could somehow prevent them or at least prepare me for them. My therapist helped me see that this quest for certainty was at the root of my suffering. The truth is, life is inherently uncertain. No amount of worrying can change that fundamental reality. Instead of continuing my futile attempt to control the uncontrollable, I began practicing what my therapist called uncertainty tolerance. This meant deliberately exposing myself to small uncertainties and sitting with the discomfort without resorting to worry. For example, I might deliberately leave the house without checking 3 times that the stove was off. Or I might not call my daughter immediately if she was a few minutes late. These small experiments helped me build confidence that I could handle uncertainty without catastrophic consequences. I also learned to distinguish between productive and unproductive worry. Productive worry leads to action. If I'm concerned about my health, I can schedule a checkup. Unproductive worry, on the other hand, focuses on things outside my control. What if I get a terrible diagnosis? Once I made this distinction, I could redirect unproductive worry toward either action or acceptance. Perhaps most importantly, I began to recognize that certainty itself is an illusion. Even people without anxiety disorders don't have certainty. They just have greater tolerance for life's inherent unpredictability. This realization was both terrifying and liberating. If certainty was impossible anyway, why waste so much energy pursuing it? It's been 5 years since that panic attack in my kitchen with Lily. I'd love to tell you that I never worry anymore, that anxiety is completely gone from my life. But that wouldn't be true, and it wouldn't be helpful to those of you still struggling. What I can tell you is this: anxiety no longer controls my life. It no longer makes my decisions for me. It no longer steals my joy or prevents me from being fully present with the people I love. I still have anxious thoughts. Sometimes I still wake up with that familiar knot in my stomach. The difference is that now I have tools to work with these experiences. I know how to respond to anxiety without being consumed by it. Last month, I flew across the country, alone, to visit my son and his family. 5 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Not only did I survive the flight without a panic attack, but I actually enjoyed parts of it. The spectacular view of the mountains, a pleasant conversation with my seatmate, even the simple pleasure of reading a book uninterrupted for several hours. When my granddaughter Lily, now 12, had her first experience with anxiety before a school presentation, I was able to sit with her, validate her feelings, and teach her some of the breathing techniques that have helped me. Watching her use these tools and successfully give her presentation was one of the proudest moments of my life. At 72, I've discovered a freedom I never thought possible. I've reclaimed countless hours previously lost to worry. I've developed a gentleness toward myself that has transformed not just my relationship with anxiety, but all my relationships. And perhaps most surprisingly, I've found that I can feel genuine gratitude for my journey with anxiety. It has taught me compassion, resilience, and the preciousness of the present moment in ways I might never have learned otherwise. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, first of all, thank you. And second, I'm guessing you might be dealing with anxiety yourself, or perhaps you love someone who is. Here's what I want you to know: change is possible at any age. I spent nearly 4 decades believing that worry was just part of who I was, that I was somehow wired to be anxious. I was wrong. The journey isn't always easy or straightforward. There were plenty of setbacks along the way. Days when old thought patterns returned with a vengeance. Times when I wondered if all this effort was worth it. But I can tell you without hesitation, it was worth every difficult moment. The freedom, peace, and joy I've experienced in these past 5 years have been worth all the hard work of changing patterns that had been with me for most of my life. If you're struggling with anxiety or chronic worry, please know that you're not alone, you're not broken, and there is hope for change. Whether you're 17 or 70, it's not too late to begin your own journey toward peace. Consider talking to a therapist who specializes in anxiety disorders and cognitive behavioral therapy. Look into mindfulness resources specifically designed for anxiety. Be gentle with yourself as you learn and grow. And remember that setbacks are not failures, they're just part of the process. If you found something helpful in my story, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing this journey, please share this video with them. Thank you for listening to this grandmother's story of transformation. Remember, worry may have been part of your past, but it doesn't have to determine your future.